You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. February's Chinese surveillance balloon saga was the latest chapter in a long diplomatic divide between the U.S. and China. But in the months since, both governments have reportedly attempted to find common ground. Back in May, I was in Detroit when U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai met with her Chinese counterpart, Commerce Minister Wang Wentao. And this summer, Biden administration officials, including U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, flew to China to build stronger relations with Beijing. But tensions remained strained, as Biden has continued to solidify relations with Japan and South Korea in recent months. On August 21st, in only his second foreign trip of 2023, President Xi Jinping traveled to South Africa to bolster Beijing's influence among developing nations at the BRICS Business Forum. It's a summit that includes representatives from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's seen as a counterbalance to the West's NATO alliance and a coalition to challenge American international influence. Despite recent reports of cooperation, U.S.-China relations appear as strained as ever. Where does this mistrust come from? And why can't Beijing and Washington come to a mutually beneficial understanding? To love China means to share a passionate commitment to overcoming the loss of face suffered in the 19th century, to ensure that the defeats of the past will never be suffered again. That's a quote from a New York Times review of Wealth and Power, a history lesson on China's modern rise. In the book, authors Orville, Schell, and John Delury argue that foreign humiliation over the past century and a half, real and imagined, is the glue that holds the country together. To Schell and Delury, shame has been the driving motivation for generations of influential Chinese politicians. And striving to overcome that shame helps explain why Xi Jinping is aggressively trying to reclaim Chinese global dominance. I knew from Chinese history there was a certain defensiveness about the decline of Qing dynasty China, that long era when a weak and decadent country became the plaything of European and other powers. Britain dictated the terms of its seizure of Hong Kong and forced opium exports into China. Germany, France, and other powers carved up chunks of China as exclusive economic zones. Foreigners called the shots. The extent to which that so-called century of humiliation remains a traumatic event in the heads of living people, the subject of posters and murals, museum exhibits, exhortations from politicians. It was something I just couldn't understand until I was living there and came across it again and again. As U.S.-China relations remains one of the largest international news stories, this week we revisit my conversation with Orville Schell and John Delury to better understand China's psychology and where Beijing may go from here. John Delury is with us, professor of Chinese studies at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks, Ray. I'm real glad to be here.
And Orville Schell joins us, director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. Great to have you with us, Dr. Schell.
Pleasure.
Together, my guests authored Wealth and Power, China's Long March to the 21st Century. And John Delury, China is big, it's rich, it's ambitious. It has the world's second largest military budget after the U.S. What should Americans know about the People's Liberation Army?
Well, you have to start by putting China in its place. You do have to understand that in some ways the United States can look over on the other side of the Pacific and see a peer. On the other hand, China in its own way has an even more difficult set of challenges in terms of its security that it has to deal with. The United States has enjoyed centuries of sort of splendid isolation, not worrying too much about national security threats from Canada and Mexico, whereas China looks around its neighborhood and sees a lot of hostile forces on its borders, a lot of countries it doesn't get along with too well. And that would include the United States, right? Which, our power extends all the way across the Pacific. in terms of U.S. military hegemony, our reach goes right up to China's borders. So the PLA, you have to sort of divide the big number in terms of the PLA's budget by not only this huge population of 1.4 odd billion people, but also some over a dozen countries along its borders, maritime and territorial borders that it has a lot of edgy, if not sometimes hostile relations with. So the PLA is growing. It's getting bigger and better. We have no reason to think that it won't continue to do so, pretty much as a proportion of the increase of China's economy. And essentially it's playing a kind of catch-up game to see if it can reach the pinnacle. And of course, the pinnacle is occupied by the United States. We have enjoyed a global military hegemony that stretches back to the Cold War, but has really expanded in the wake of the post-Cold War with the kind of falling away of the Soviet Union into a much weaker Russia. So that's the big picture. It's certainly something Americans need to be studying and worried about, but they also do need to recognize that China at this point is not an aggressive power, frankly, in the way that the United States has been quite militarily aggressive for the last couple decades. So it's a difficult thing to analyze because you have to reflect as Americans on your own sense of world power, even as you look very coldly at China's increased capacity.
Orville, Schell, if our listeners pull out a map, they'll find John Delury is unquestionably right. China has a huge number of neighbors, an unusual number of neighbors, even for a big country. But the comparisons with the United States military are many. Its origin, its history, what it's for, what it's done in the world, as John Delury alluded to. How does the way the Chinese think about their army and what the army is supposed to do, how is it different from the way Americans have thought about their armed forces, certainly since World War II?
Well, I think to fully understand how the Chinese Communist Party and a large portion of the populace of China look at their military, it's helpful to set this moment in sort of a historical context. Because I think part of what the People's Liberation Army means to China is that China sort of at last is arriving back at the global status that it lost sometime during the Qing dynasty, before it became the sick man of Asia and the 20th century fell apart and disunity occupied by Japan. So I think in a certain sense, the People's Liberation Army is an expression of what Xi Jinping refers to when he talks about the rejuvenation of power. Because remember that in any rejuvenation, and John and I wrote a book titled this, Wealth and Power lies right at the heart of the matter. And what's power? Well, if you're a country that's drunk the Leninist Kool-Aid and has the narrative of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, anti-foreignism, et cetera, you do have a somewhat circumspect view of the developed world or liberal democratic world. And the PLA, I think, is very much seen as an element in this rejuvenation strategy that's also can be described as Xi Jinping's China dream, because it represents China having agency in the world. Now, how powerful is China's military? Well, that's a very different question. It's certainly much more advanced. They have 2 aircraft carriers. They're getting a 3rd, but they're not very battle-tested. The last time they went to war was against Vietnam in 1979, and they got their clock cleaned by a small tributary nation to the south. So we have to be mindful of not overrating the People's Liberation Army in terms of its power and its threat. But on the other hand, it would be very foolish to underrate it. So we're kind of trying to figure this out.
Let's talk a little bit more about that century of humiliation. I was living in China recently and was surprised, frankly, about how often it came up in what China said to Chinese about the country, about why it does the things it does. The century of humiliation is not something that's a present memory in the minds of living Chinese. 1949, the rise of the People's Republic, that's just about all Chinese who have been born after the advent of World War II. They don't remember the treaty ports and the Opium War and all that stuff. Why is that such a vital, evocative, powerful metaphor, both in the way the government uses it, and they must think it has some effect, John Delury, or they wouldn't bring it up?
Well, you make a great point, Ray. I mean, it's not a lived experience, but that doesn't mean it's not a remembered one, right? And you felt that when you were in Shanghai, and Orville for many decades, going back to his first trip, and me a few decades, have detected that along the way. That's part of why we wanted to write our book, Wealth and Power, is to understand. Remember, there's this key phrase, 勿忘国耻, don't forget the national humiliation, right? So the lived experience is now pre-1949. Most people can't recall that in their own lifespan, but this is not something Xi Jinping started. You know, we make a lot of analytical mistakes because we're kind of obsessed with Xi Jinping and think Xi is year zero. There's so much continuation in the Xi era. His so-called new era is in many ways just an extension of the previous eras. And so this drilling into the public consciousness, the national consciousness, the basic identity of what it means to be Chinese in the 20th century, now in the 21st century, is almost inextricably connected to this notion of we can't forget our national humiliation. And I think one thing I would add is that in terms of that core identity as a Chinese person vis-a-vis Chinese, it's the contrast with what precedes the humiliation, right? Because in the historical arc of China, Orville talked about kind of the modern period, which is framed around the fall that begins with the British gunboats showing up and the Treaty of Nanjing in the 1840s. But before that, in the kind of crude national memory, you have one glorious dynasty after another stretching back to time immemorial. You know, Xi Jinping famously schooling Donald Trump over chocolate cake about our 8,000-year-old civilization, right? So that notion of a fall from a kind of centrality, right? Center of the known world, center of the civilized world, center of culture and arts and learning and all of these incredible things, science, technology of pre-modern China, Chinese people carry that around as well, right? And so they're still in the period of coming out of the darkness into the light. And I remember when Orville and I did that book, that's 10 years ago, and we did a spin-off sort of op-ed for the Wall Street Journal. And that was actually translated very nicely into Chinese. And the message of that was, hey, look, as Americans really interested in China, we feel like you might be time for a new narrative, you know, because no one's looking at China and thinking about how humiliated it is. And there was a lot of pushback from high to that notion. So in that way, she very much doubled down on, no, we cannot forget the humiliation. And again, the implicit contrast between the ancient greatness, the pre-modern greatness of China, and then this lapsed period that we are climbing, still very much crawling and climbing our way out of.
Orville, when does China get to put that to bed? I was astounded, I have to say, by the way in which the century of humiliation was used as an excuse for China not being a place that wears its power and its new status in the world comfortably and well. It was all defensive, throwing its weight around, not being prepared to take any guff from anybody, and the century of humiliation constantly being used as a justification, instead of this country saying, hey, world, look at us. Look at what we've done in 30 years. Look at what we've done to our country. Look at what we've done for our people. It was all sort of defensive instead of wearing the mantle of a great power comfortably in a way that says, we don't care what people say about us. We create our own weather. We create our own gravity because we're huge and we're rich and we're powerful. Instead, there's still this grinding thing about past insults and past assaults, which I found very interesting. I'm not a sinologist, I'm not an expert in the area, but I do pay attention.
Well, I think you've sort of put a well-sanded fingertip on really the heart of the matter. And that is this. If you have a narrative of victimization, exploitation, humiliation, and one could go on, and at the same time, you strive to be successful, there's an absolute contradiction between the failure of being a victim and the success of being a victor. And China doesn't seem to be able to vault over that chasm. And it is very strange because you would think, having really created the most extraordinary miracle of economic development, I think, in world history, you'd think they would have much to crow about. And as you suggest, let the victimization narrative drift and become comfortable, more comfortable in the world, more equal, and be able to enjoy their accomplishments. But no. And this is where I think Xi Jinping deserves some very special attention, because I think that the challenge in certain ways is that he came of age during the Maoist revolution and never went abroad, doesn't speak a foreign language. I think fundamentally does not feel very comfortable or soluble in the outside world with Macron and Schultz or Merkel or whoever, and Biden speaking many languages and backslapping. I think he feels quite on the margins. And this narrative is a kind of an expression of the sense that China is still somehow not respected and accepted. And the problem is this, that as long as it's an autocracy, no matter how hard the West tries, and remember, Western liberal democratic nations, 9 U.S. presidential administrations supported engagement, but it didn't turn the worm. And this is China's challenge, is to overcome its old narrative and replace it with a new one. And when you go to Vietnam, which not only was imperialized by the French and outright colonialized, unlike China, or Indonesia, that was a Dutch colony, you go to these countries, nobody's talking about the Dutch or the French and the oppression of the past. So it's very odd that China retains this victimization culture. And one last little thought. It is precisely this syndrome of victimization that I think she shares with Putin. And it is this syndrome, a psychological syndrome, really, which bonds these two leaders, if not the two countries, together, because they both feel spurned, disesteemed, and looked down upon.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. John Delury, there's that idea of an 8,000-year-old civilization, but it's an 8,000-year-old civilization with a 100-year-old governing party and a 75-year-old political order and a 75-year-old military. And it is fascinating to see the use of the military domestically. You ride the Shanghai Metro, and there are commercials for the military on big video screens inside the rail car as you're zipping from one part of the city to another. Beautifully produced, gorgeously shot, magnificent pieces of filmmaking, posters and billboards, commercials on television showing aircraft streaking across the sky, perfect precision marches on the deck of an aircraft carrier, maneuvers, jumping across obstacle courses and so on. It's all meant to create, and understandably so, pride in the country's military and, of course, pride in the country itself. China's not very different from a lot of other places in the world in that regard. The military is seen as a sort of emblem of national identity. But you and Orville mentioned that they haven't had to fight much. And at the outset, you talked about how threatened China feels. in some ways, this doesn't all add up. Kyrgyzstan is not going to invade China. Turkmenistan isn't going to invade China. Even giant India, which has its tensions with China, is not really any kind of threat. So do they feel threatened in some ways out of proportion to the actual amount of threat out there?
Well, first of all, Ray, I think Orville and I are both very jealous hearing you describe observations from a recent visit to China. It's been so long now that so many of us have been able to see that. It sounds familiar, maybe a little more sleek than what I observed, but that kind of propaganda around the military, that's obviously a very important metric of Chinese nationalism. And as you say, it's everywhere. I mean, I'm here in South Korea. There's universal male conscription, getting military propaganda all the time. The United States is certainly has its fair share, but it's an important metric. And one thing I think on this piece about the PLA that should be mentioned, it's often said and noted in terms of, you asked for the differences, that technically it is the army of the party. Its loyalty is to the CP, almost in the way that as Americans we like to think, and you'll hear generals sometimes say, look, I serve the Constitution. But the way that works in a Chinese context is that they have successfully for now conflated party and nation, right? So party equals nation, and an army that's loyal to the party is simultaneously loyal to the nation. And so all of that sleek propaganda and marketing that you observed, getting Chinese folks either wanting to serve or feeling a sense of national pride in their armed forces, again, that's a core part of this building up of a new kind of identity. I mean, I don't think this is going to hold forever, to the question of narrative. The century of humiliation as a pillar of public memory, it will fall eventually. And the stronger it gets, the harder it is to maintain that sense of victimization that Orville was talking about. And so this goes to your question, Ray. I mean, do Chinese people really feel threatened, and by whom? And I would say they don't feel threatened. I mean, you're sitting in Beijing and you're not worried about Japan invading again or threatening to invade again, or the allied nations, 8 countries invaded Beijing, including the United States, over a century ago. So no, you don't have that sense of fear of your territorial sovereignty being breached. But we have to remember that territory is an old empire. It's roughly an 18th century empire that the Qing dynasty put together. And when you get far out into the reaches of Xinjiang province in the northwest, you are getting into areas where, of course, there's a huge amount of tension with the ethnic minorities, with the religious minorities. There's been a lot of reporting around the Uyghur issue in the last few years. And, of course, you have a similar story when you get out into Tibet. You know, those are parts of an empire, a Eurasian empire, that almost miraculously the People's Republic of China, Communist China, has held on to. And so when you get out into those far stretches, there's a different feeling. There is a real concern, not in terms of an imminent invasion, but of just holding this thing together. That's important, too, to keep in mind, because I actually think, in a way, that is what limits the threat that China presents to others. China is already at its absolute max. You know, if you know the history, if you look at the maps, dynasty after dynasty, it was the Qing dynasty that put this thing together. Mao held onto it by the skin of his teeth. But this is as big as China gets. So there aren't kind of natural ways in which, as a historical construct, this place, quote unquote, China wants to expand. The one big exception, of course, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is the island of Taiwan. But other than that, the challenge is holding on to this vast territory.
Well, Orville, the Chinese have not been big on projecting their power into the far corners of the world. There was a lot of attention paid, a lot of fanfare around the Chinese facility at Djibouti, which sits at a vital, critical point where the Suez Canal and the Red Sea open up into the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. It's really far from China. What should the world make of that? Is China sort of trying on the idea that it's a world power now?
I think this century of humiliation narrative has really kindled within China a very large dream, not just of territorial sovereignty and integrity, but of China as not one among many, but even a prima inter pares, to be the big dog. And you mentioned Djibouti, but there also is a port in Pakistan now. There's also Sri Lanka. There's a port kind of in play. Cambodia has just developed a port. There's the Belt and Road. If I can just raise a personal kind of reflection, we really are looking at a potential tragedy here with China. And I mean by that in a classic Greek sense, where overweening ambition brings the whole kingdom down, the leader down. And you remember in Greek tragedies, leaders, many of them are very smart, very able, very victorious, but there's something about their ambition and their hubris and their overweening reach which weighs them low. And I think that this could be the problem in China, that it wants to not just exist in the world, be well respected in the world as a kind of a major power and an equal, but to do precisely what it imagines in this narrative of victimization was done to it, namely, to do a little bullying themselves, to be the big dog on the block. And that's, I think, in a certain measure, what's animating their extraordinarily expansionary vision of the South China Sea. And the tragedy for me, as I look at this, is that they are generating the kind of antipathy in the countries that are around them that is completely unnecessary. I mean, Japan, Korea, now the Philippines is starting to turn. We now have rights to 9 Philippine bases after being thrown out. The second island chain is kind of in play. India has suddenly turned. Australia is completely gone. So there's a kind of a terrible self-fulfilling prophecy of this victimization narrative, which is that it antagonizes the very people that in a world with China rising peacefully would be perfectly happy to continue trading and getting along with China. We could have continued engagement if Xi Jinping hadn't put a stake through its heart. And that, to me, is a very dangerous sort of situation that we now find ourselves in. And I hope that better sense and a more moderate, less adversarial kind of view of the world outside can take grip in China. But of course, as China arms, as China pushes, as wolf warrior diplomacy expands, people become more and more alarmed, more hostile towards China. And thus, ultimately, the place becomes much more unstable. And you mentioned Taiwan. Well, that's right at the center of the radioactive core of what could go awry. And we could have a second war like the invasion of the Ukraine. And then we could be off to a world war if we aren't careful.
John Delury, you agree? You're willing to go as far as Orville Schell just did?
I probably come up a little short of Orville in terms of, I'm Irish, so I certainly see tragedy about to break out everywhere. But in terms of the threat that China poses, I actually see it as still maybe in an earlier phase as far as the places I worry about and the level of expansion that I see. Certainly, I worry a lot about Taiwan, but even in the case of Taiwan, when I read the latest war game and these invasion scenarios, it just doesn't gel with what I'm seeing in terms of even the language of the party, let alone their strategy. I think if we start with Taiwan, they're working on quote unquote peaceful, coercive and subversive, but still a peaceful plan to bring the island back one day in the fold. Very difficult, but still not primarily a military kind of plan that I think they're working on. And frankly, I think we as Americans, we tend to over-militarize a lot of our foreign policy. And I think we're now doing that with the Taiwan question and preparing for an invasion that's not going to come and not doing enough to prepare for the real threats to Taiwan. And in terms of the broader global picture, I think China is still in a phase where they are focused on economic and, by extension, political influence. So I worry about those things. But still, I see it largely in an economic phase rather than a military phase. I mean, if you match up what China has, the base in Djibouti, and then just look at what the United States has in terms of the global military footprint, I mean, we're not even in the same ballpark, right? And I think it would take Orville's most tragic picture. It would take a world war, a large-scale regional war, to accelerate, but in a very dramatic way, accelerate China into that sort of global military expansion. I don't see it happening in sort of the Xi era in the next decade. It's a gradual process that I see unfolding, and still largely not a military one. I think that, and you can read this in some of their literature, everyone's been studying the United States, certainly including China. And we have a lot of lessons of failed, let's not forget our forever wars and our failed invasions and occupations of countries that have gone very bad for those countries and ultimately very badly for the United States, for the health of our country. China's learned some of those lessons, right? I mean, in terms of not falling down the pit of imperial overstretch. So I think there's a little bit more caution in terms of how they approach exercising the military side of being a world power. I absolutely agree about the ambition, but I think they are looking at a lot more tools than the military one to achieve it.
But this summer will be 125 years since Admiral Dewey sailed into Manila Bay. The United States has been at this a long time.
Yeah, I would agree with John that, I'm not predicting military conflict, but things happen. We've had many incidents. Look at this balloon incident. And we've had fighter planes coming within 100 feet of each other. And we had the EP-3. It would not take much now to trigger something a little larger, then a little larger. And you see the way things are changing, the way Japan has now declared Taiwan. It has an interest in what happens in Taiwan. Marcos in the Philippines has said that. The Australians have said that. Things are dividing up in a way, and things are getting tenser. And I think what China might do, not invade Taiwan, but they could very easily, just something would happen and Xi Jinping would think, I've got to respond somehow, and throw a blockade around Taiwan. Then what are we going to do? So there are steps in between. There are stations of the cross, which could lead to, apocalypse, but wouldn't be an outright amphibious invasion across the Taiwan Straits.
Well, is that part of the problem right there, that the United States may not be fully cognizant of the fact that China feels a need for respect that might look from Washington as if it's exaggerated, but looks pretty normal when you're sitting in Beijing? That it's not so much that China wants to invade and reconquer Taiwan, but boy, it is annoyed if the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States goes there, or Joe Biden announces that the United States is going to protect Taiwanese autonomy. Don't act as if we're about to invade, but also don't tell us we can't if we want to.
This is the big debate in China policy right now, and it's a very important debate, and there are two arguments there are good arguments on both sides of this one. Because on the one hand, you do want to send a clear signal, the classic deterrence argument. You don't want China to be confused about how the United States would respond. I'm sitting here in Korea, and one of the textbook cases of bad deterrence signaling was when the Truman administration actually signaled, you can do what you want with South Korea. That's not in our, the famous Atchison line. This is way back in 1950. And Kim Il-sung's like, okay, great, with Stalin and Mao's approval, and you've got the Korean War. And so on the one hand, you want to have strategic clarity, which some people argue for now, to be clear, as President Biden is kind of doing, although the statements are walked back, but to say, no, we, the United States, will come to the military defense of Taiwan if attacked, if invaded. That's the one side. The other side of the argument, though, is more to your point, Ray, where, the United States has to be realistic about this in terms of first of all, the legal status of Taiwan, which we don't even recognize Taiwan, right, as an independent country, and also the geopolitical realities, and to avoid actually making the problem worse with aggressive signaling. And some of this is case by case. In my view, did former Speaker Pelosi need to make that trip at that time? I never heard the argument. She kind of wanted to go. And so she went. But anyone who knows the first thing about Beijing knows that they're going to have to do something, as we say. And it's in those contexts of having to do something that, as Orville described, suddenly you can get yourself in a scenario that neither side really wanted. So I think that we do have to be very careful. I would not throw what's called strategic ambiguity out the window. The United States government has to be very careful and very deliberate about how much we want to alter the status quo. We help to create this status quo. The status quo is de facto independence, but not de jure independence for Taiwan, and putting all effort onto peaceful resolutions. But you have to leave the door open to mainland China. And this is not just the government. In my experience, people, Lao Baixing, the average person in China, they care about Taiwan and they feel it is theirs. It belongs to one place, China. So you do have to respect, I think, the Chinese public by at least leaving the door open to peaceful reunification one day. But this is the big debate. Orville's over there more in the belly of the whale there and goes to Washington. And this is where I think a lot of the argument is. And again, these are going to be difficult decisions for this administration, for the next administration, for the administration after that. This one is not going away in terms of U.S.-China policy.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, Orville Schell and John Delury look to China's future as a global superpower and whether U.S.-China relations are irreparable. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Orville Schell, it wasn't all that long ago when people were looking at a liberalizing, growing China and speculating about a future where the two entities, Taiwan and mainland China, might peacefully reunite. Has Chinese treatment of Hong Kong put that date, if it ever happens, further and further into the future? Do the Taiwanese look at Hong Kong and say, well, whatever it is we were thinking about, we don't want any part of that?
Well, I think, the pragmatic genius of Deng Xiaoping, who confected the notion of one country, two systems, that China would allow Hong Kong to be a special administrative region with a high degree of autonomy for 50 years, was pretty brilliant. But it took an awful lot of flexibility and an awful lot of tolerance to imagine that. And then when demonstrations started, we all know what happened. So I think it's fair to say that the idea of one country, two systems is deader than a doornail for Taiwan. They're not going to drink that Kool-Aid. However, you are absolutely correct. There was a period when Ma Ying-jeou was president of Taiwan, and there were hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. 400,000 Taiwanese were working in China. And we thought, oh, good, let's just hug it out. We'll trade more. There are students going to Taiwan from the mainland. But, that ended when engagement ended and when Xi Jinping arrived. And I do think it's really important for listeners to understand that engagement was, in a certain sense, in my view, really a high stage of American diplomacy to try to work things out peacefully, even with a country like China, which is a one-party rule, a communist country. But it takes reciprocity to keep that going. And we lost that, not because the United States turned on China, but because I think China began to get more wealthy and more powerful and thought, well, okay, we don't need to keep marching under the banner of peaceful rise. And that was very soothing to everybody. So the slogan changed, and they wanted to arrogate the right also to throw their weight around a bit. And they did. And that really got everybody crazy and scared and frightened. And the result is all of these alliances formed around them, AUKUS, the Quad, Five Eyes. And this made China more paranoid. This made the PLA justify the need for much greater expenditures on the military. And we are in a spiral upwards of militarization of Asia, which, in my view, was completely unnecessary. But it was precipitated, not completely, but largely by things that happened within China when they started saying that South China Sea is ours. Get off our ranch.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the South China Sea because that's where I want to go next. When I look at Taiwan and I look at the mainland's attachment to Taiwan, it's an extension in many ways of the century of humiliation narrative because Taiwan was occupied, it was colonized, it was held away from Chinese authority for a long time, even before 1949. And it's part of that we're not going to be pushed around anymore thing. But the 9-dash line, and some of you at home are scratching your head and thinking, what the heck is the 9-dash line? To take basically a marking pen out of your pocket and extend the territorial waters of your country unilaterally into an enormous body of water, take a bunch of rock outcroppings and dump tons of soil on them and make them into islands and put airfields on some of those islands, that's pretty audacious stuff. That's unilaterally changing the map of the world in a way that the post-1945 order is uncomfortable with. Is the South China Sea sort of flying under the radar as a flashpoint? Are we paying enough attention to what that might mean, not only in practical terms, but also in what it means about how China thinks about itself? Hey, we can pull a marking pen out of our pocket and change the map of the world. John Delury?
Well, I'll let Orville talk about China now with its pen in the pocket, but I do have to point out a couple of historical ironies of this 9-dash line. The first being that it's actually drawn in 1947 by Chiang Kai-shek, of all people, right? So the mortal enemy of Mao Zedong and the communists. So if nothing else, and which, is, of course, the beginning of the Taiwan story. And so, ironically, one legal point of agreement, maybe not politically, but legal point of agreement between the government in Taipei and the government in Beijing is that actually they share this 9-dash line idea of just how expansive China's presence should be in those maritime waters. So that's one point that we just have to at least note and maybe laugh at how we got to this situation, because it's recently that the PRC, the government in Beijing, said, oh, yeah, we like that line too. But the second historical irony I do think we, again, have to grapple with, and I guess this is how I think about these things as an American, is kind of going back and forth between Chinese history and American history, is, in fact, if you go back, now you got to get back to the 19th century, but I would encourage your listeners to read this incredible book, How to Hide an Empire, by Daniel Imberwar, a historian at Northwestern. And what a great lesson that was for me in terms of our maritime expansion over the course, again, mostly of the later 19th century, but into the 20th century. And then that would include things like the colonization of the Philippines. But all of the maritime claims and these little islands that our U.S. Navy militarized as we expanded our presence out to these island chains that we talked about. And so there is, in fact, a kind of 9-dash line that the United States has over a century and a half established. And let me tell you, I've lived here in South Korea for a dozen years. You certainly feel it. You feel it in terms of the presence of a place like Guam. What is Guam? It's not a state. It's a territory that is heavily militarized. We just added a new Marine unit there for the first time in 70 years. But, it's an arms depot. It's a heavily militarized U.S. territory to project our footprint and our power way out across the Pacific Ocean. So I'll just add those ironies and let Orville take the hard part of your question, which is what are the Chinese up to by claiming this 9-dash line now?
Well, I think, yeah, I take note, as Richard Nixon said, of differences over Taiwan, of the ironies you raise. And Chiang Kai-shek, sure, he was a good Leninist, just like Mao Zedong. And they both supped at the Soviet fountain in the 1920s and learned how to organize a Leninist party. The Kuomintang, the nationalists, were organized pretty much like the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, fine. But that doesn't make it right for the Chinese to claim everything from Hainan Island to the Natunas Islands off of Indonesia, just because the United States did some version of it. And let me just one further thought on the ironies that you point out, John, of the expansionary nature of America and its military. I think here is where the question of political system becomes extremely important, because there is a competition going on behind the military competition of political systems. And this is where the question is, what do countries feel comfortable with? American imperialism or Chinese imperialism? Well, maybe they don't like either, but they might feel better about one or the other. I don't see a whole lot of people running off to live in China, whereas America is being overrun with immigrants. So I think the question of political system is really important. And I think we would all agree that China's political system does not win a soft power sweepstakes.
Well, nicely put, Orville. Gentlemen, let me close. We've been talking about the People's Liberation Army. We've been talking about a newly powerful and ambitious China. What do the next 20 years look like? And does a lot of that depend on, in the China case, one man, Xi Jinping?
Well, historians are trained never make predictions. You know, that's our Hippocratic oath here. The past does not tell you the future. But to break my oath, since you asked, Ray, of course, none of us know. And China has surprised us many times. You know, Orville and I, when we get together and on trips in China, often reflect on when we were writing our book, we got to be careful about predicting anything, because look at this history and look at the reversals. It's really incredible, the modern history of China. We've simplified it a little bit today into this century of humiliation narrative. But if you actually go back and look at the history step by step, there are just incredible twists and turns. Not many of us, the best China experts, predicted the Xi era very well. You know, we've had to make sense of it as it's unfolded. And so we're probably not going to do a good job predicting the post-Xi era. One sort of point I would put out there is an interesting thing about the way in which Xi, defying our expectations, has prolonged his tenure. At least 5 more years, maybe 10, some say for life. I doubt that. But let's say it's 10. Well, there's going to be the potential for a pretty dramatic shift a decade from now when Xi is finally out of the picture, because you're going to have a kind of generation gap. And his cultural revolution generation, which Orville talked about, the importance of that, will have dominated this long period. And I think Chinese people at that point will be so sick of it. I think they're already getting a little sick of Xi. 10 years from now, I think they'll be really sick and tired of this formula. And there will be a younger crop of, let's say it's still party cadres, but they're formed by a different experience. Maybe this whole humiliation thing, they grew up with it, but it's starting to feel really remote from them. And so we could see at that point, finally, this kind of new vision of China as you started us out with as a world power. I mean, the thing I would love, and here's where you get Pollyanna-ish, I realize, but can China, can the United States for that matter, get away from the notion of power, world power, defining what it means to exist in the world? I mean, do we have to think in terms of great powers and superpowers and world powers? Or as Orville and I wrote about, literally in our book, wealth and power. This notion of power is kind of taken for granted in international relations circles. But I guess my hopeful vision is in 20 years from now, you ask, you know, a China that is less obsessed with how much national power it has and how much it can exercise it, because it really has evolved and transformed yet again into a new place in its history. So Orville gave us a very tragic vision of the future. I'll offer a hopeful one there.
Orville Schell?
Well, John's absolutely right. We'd never predicted a single turning point in China in terms of how it would turn. I would just counsel everybody to remember this. I think it's helpful to look upon China as a country that's sort of deeply unresolved. And here's where being a historian helps somewhat. Because if you look back over the last 100, 150 years, you see that it's like tectonic plates that are rubbing up against each other. There are different traditions of openness, more democratic governance, more sort of liberal sentiment. And on the other side, there's a very powerful tradition of autocracy that goes back to the dynastic period and then to the adoption of Leninism. But these two forces and myriad other things that sort of scattered between them are in a constant state of tension. And at one moment, one will express itself, and in another moment, another will express itself more fulsomely. And sometimes you don't see any evidence of one side of that divide. And right now in China, you see no hint whatsoever, except when we have a little upwelling of lava, as we did with the white paper revolution, that there is this other tradition still there. It is there. And when something happens that we can't imagine, it will start to re-express itself, as it has over the past century and a half, repeatedly. So there's more to come here, and big leaders sit and block the door for a while, and then something happens to them and something else comes out. When I was in China in 1975 and Mao was alive and the Cultural Revolution was still going, if you had said to me, well, hang on, pal, wait a few years, Deng Xiaoping will be here, we'll have one of the most extraordinary reform periods in world history, I would have laughed them out of the room. But it happened.
Orville Schell and John Delury together wrote Wealth and Power, China's Long March to the 21st Century. John Delury is a professor of Chinese studies at Yonsei University in Seoul and author most recently of Agents of Subversion, The Fate of John T. Downey and the CIA's Covert War in China. And Orville Schell is the director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. Great to have you both. Terrific to talk to you.
Nice to be with you, Ray.
Thanks a lot, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Matteo Schimpf and Andrew Stelzer, mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.